Hello everyone, welcome to Asian Pacific Shows. In this episode today, we are bringing one of the world's most important region on the table and discuss the Great Powers Rivalry in this region. Our region will be Northeast Asia. I'm joining by my guest, Dylan Motin. Dylan is a PhD candidate majoring in political science at Kangon National University and a researcher at the Center for International Strategic Studies. His research expertise revolved around international relations theory, and his main interests are a balance of power theory and great power competition and Korean affairs. He is the author and bandwagoning in international relations, China, Russia, and their neighbors, Vernon Press, 2024. I'm gonna drop the Dylan's book link at the end, the comment section of the video. If audiences want to order a hard copy or buy on the Kindle, you will find it later. Hi Dylan, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me today.
Dylan, as I said, the Northeast Asia occupy a crucial role in international relations, like many other parts of the world, like the Persian Gulf, like the European, and the also great power competition in this region is important, has regional and international implications. And how do I'm just gonna start from the Cold War process. How do the legacies of the Cold War influence the current dynamics of the great powers rivalry in Northeast Asia, for example, between the US and the China and also the Russia as a neighbor of Northeast Asia? What will be your opinion?
Well, I know that you can hear very often that people saying that the conflict over Taiwan or the Korean Peninsula are continuations of the Cold War. I would like to push against this narrative. Of course, it depends on about what do you call the Cold War. What was the Cold War for you? If you consider that the Cold War was basically an ideological conflict between communism and capitalism, if you consider that the Cold War was a conflict about ideology, of course, there's no Cold War today, in the sense that the US or China or Russia are not fighting over who is going to be a communist or who is going to be a capitalist. This is not the core of the conflict. And if you consider the Cold War as a bipolar conflict between two great powers, the Soviet Union and the United States, this is also gone, because you mentioned the name of China. Clearly today in East Asia, the dominant great power is not Russia, not the Soviet Union anymore. So I don't think that going back to the first Cold War is very interesting to explaining the second Cold War.
You know, it means that a new Cold War between the US and China. Am I right?
Yes, this time is very different because the first Cold War was centered over Europe. And for several centuries, Europe had been the heart or the core of power politics, for the simple reason that Europe was the center of industrial and technological development for many centuries. And also it was a region with a lot of people, meaning a lot of wealth concentrated over a small geographic area. So you had first the Germans during the First World War, the Second World War, and then the Soviets, who hoped to become regional hegemons, meaning they wanted to dominate the entire European region to get all these resources to accomplish their objectives. Now, today, there has been a shift where Europe is not anymore this dominant hub of wealth, but the biggest hub of wealth, the biggest center of resources in the system now is in East Asia. Europe is number two, if you want. So that's why this new competition is focused over there, because the Chinese want to make sure that this entire region and all the power resources you have in East Asia stay within their zone of influence. And the US want to make sure that this does not happen, so they want to contain Chinese power.
Dylan, maybe we can discuss the US and China competition and the Cold War, whether isn't or not later. But I just would you like to go to a little bit detail of these questions when we're talking about the legacies of the Cold War. What will be your opinion? Because I think the European Union resolved it is the Cold War legacies to some extent. But when we come to the Northeast Asia, for example, still the countries there is, I think, the legacy like um, the China is divided between the Taiwan and China, and the similar issues still existing in the Korean Peninsula between North Korea and the South Korea. But Vietnam, I think, resolved these issues from the North Vietnam and South Vietnam. In this regard, is it possible to say the Cold War legacy or the communist US and the Soviet competition's influence still existing in Northeast Asia?
I would be careful to just call it a Cold War legacy in the sense that, once again, when the Cold War ended, there was a movement toward an improvement in relations both between China and Taiwan and between the two Koreas. So when the Cold War ended in Korea, the North Koreans understood that the Soviet Union wouldn't be there anymore to support them, and that the US would be dominant with South Korea as an ally. So during the early 1990s, you had some kind of deep fear in North Korea. So they tried to have some kind of improved relation with the South, but it didn't last for very long. And the same go for Taiwan. At first, from the 1980s up to the late 2000s, the Chinese and the Taiwanese actually had quite good relations, and you could see that China, the People's Republic of China, became the number one economic partner of Taiwan, actually. So I wouldn't just say it's a Cold War legacy. I think that this new Cold War, this second Cold War, is not due to the remnants of the first one. I think it is because the power dynamics have changed so deeply now in East Asia due to the rise of China. But maybe it has awoken some ancient conflict, but I don't think it is just a continuation or just a following of what happened during the first Cold War.
Okay. So I'm going to ask about the concept of bipolarity and multipolarity. Has the concept of bipolarity between the US and USSR been replaced by multipolarity in Northeast Asia, and how does this impact the regional security or security architecture?
I would be careful about using the concept of multipolarity. I know it's very trendy these days, and it appears in many publications all day long. But for me, multipolarity means that you have a system with several great powers. That's not what we are having today in East Asia or in the world globally. I would say that now you have in the world, on the globe, you have only 3 states which I would qualify as a pole, as a great power. Of course, the United States, which is still number one. It's exhausted, it is overstretched, but it's still number one. And coming close behind it, China, uh, which has become incredibly wealthy and has translated this new wealth into military power. And as a distant number 3, I will still make Russia a great power. Although Russia is not an economic giant, it has maintained a formidable military force and its huge legacy nuclear arsenal. So Russia is still a great power, but number 3, quite far away. So that was the globe. And when you look at East Asia, the situation is closer to a bipolar system because Russia is foremost a European power. It is very focused on what's going on in Europe, and all the more so since the war in Ukraine. So Russia has very little strength to project in the region, and it is quite a secondary player. So I would argue that in East Asia, you functionally have only two great powers, the US and China. And when it comes to the implications, I think it's very clear. You've seen for the last 7 years, almost since Donald Trump came in power, that the region has become separated or cut into two camps or two growing blocks. You have on one side the United States with its traditional allies, um, South Korea, Taiwan, the Philippines, Australia. You remember the AUKUS moment when we even had the US bringing in the UK from Europe to support Australia. And this new bipolar system is also bringing to the US side some new countries, India, even Vietnamese who have shown signs of moving in that direction. And the other side, of course, is China. And China doesn't have a lot of friends. Um, Russia is one. North Korea is a reluctant one. I have long been arguing that the North Koreans are deeply afraid of Chinese power, but still, North Korea is far closer to China. So that's a bipolar system which is forming, and you are increasingly two camps with a very clear dividing border.
Do you think in the foreseeable future, the country like India will be a pole?
Oh, well, actually, I believe that India is the most likely candidate for becoming a great power in the next future. Uh, I said there were three great powers for me. The best chance for the international system to move toward multipolarity and not tripolarity. Multipolarity is for India to become one. I think India is close to the moment it will have enough economic power to become a great power, but it is still lacking, I believe, in military capabilities. Uh, it doesn't have, for instance, the defense industry, which would allow it to have a self-sustained military. It has to import most of its weaponry from abroad. So I think that's a big no if you want to be a great power. But India is the closest call, and I do believe that maybe 20 years down the road, it will be a pole.
Dylan, from the IR theories framework, when we imply IR theories like the realism and the liberalism to the Northeast Asian region, how these theories explain the great power competition, whether the situation here, I think, the John Mearsheimer argued that we are in a multipolar world order, because he said the bipolar world order has been has finished after the disintegration of the Soviet Union. And I think he still again argued that in 2017, I think he said we entered to the multipolar world order. I think that this is one of the reasons that Xi Jinping come to power, and the global financial crisis affect to the situation. And also he again Mearsheimer argued that he said that Russia, Vladimir Putin rescued Russia from the collapse. Well, how do you see this from the IR theories framework, this competition in Northeast Asia and situation on the global level?
Well, maybe you remember from our previous encounters that I am closer to the realist side of the fence. So, of course, I broadly agree with John Mearsheimer, not on everything, but broadly. But I will try to summarize what the liberals used to say about East Asia in the most honest and fair way possible. So, after the end of the Cold War, the dominant liberal approach or idea was that power competition in East Asia would slowly fade away or disappear because the regional countries, and foremost China, would be deeply interested in maintaining productive relations not only with their neighbors but also with the US in order to benefit from trade and to grow their economy even faster. And they also made the case that because the Cold War was over and China and others, the Soviet Union and Vietnam and former communist countries, now were accepting the rules of the game. They were accepting the idea of a rules-based order. So you cannot violate other people's border. You cannot meddle into other countries' domestic politics. You have to obey a number of law and rules. So because all these countries would be deeply interested into maintaining trade and maintaining norms and international laws, power competition had disappeared. And therefore, the rise of China would not bring any major conflict because China would not be interested into changing the regional or the world order. I think that was the dominant liberal theory, and people like me, or of course John Mearsheimer and many others also, argued for a long time that this was never going to happen because as soon as China would become wealthy, uh, it would want to translate this new found money, the new found wealth, into military capabilities. And once you become powerful enough, when you have enough military power, it's become very tempting to you for you to actually change your the status quo in your favor and to solve the conflicts you have around. We mentioned China, Taiwan in the beginning. Now that China is becoming powerful enough to think about actually unifying with Taiwan, you see the Chinese becoming far more aggressive. And you mentioned Russia in your question. When Vladimir Putin came into power, he found Russia on the brink of collapse and civil war, and he managed to consolidate the central government, to restart the economy, to rebuild the military. And as soon as Russia stabilized and again managed to field an impressive military force, it went to war against Georgia in 2008 to make sure that Georgia would not become part of NATO. And of course, recently you saw that Russia tried to conquer Ukraine and still trying to conquer Ukraine. This is all because the balance of power has changed, and as great powers like Russia came back from the dead, or China emerged as a new great power, it had the means to pursue its ambitions.
So from here, do you think that which theory is more close to the reality today? And secondly, what kind of the new uh, regional order or security order emerging in Northeast Asia, and how the great power competitions visions differ in this region between especially China and US allies, and maybe partly we can include Russia.
Mm. Uh, I don't think I will surprise you by saying that I believe that realism
It's most close
is
to the
is
realism.
closer to the truth.
Truth.
I do believe that the liberal
But by
argument.
the way, which part of the realism? Offensive, defensive?
Well, great powers do not really act upon what defensive realism would expect. Uh, Actually, in the defensive realist story, maybe we could explain to the listeners what is the difference between the two. But basically, defensive realists believe that the main driver of state foreign policy is the quest for security, meaning that when you come to believe that you are safe enough, that you have enough security, you will stop trying to expand or to grow your power. And offensive realists tend to argue that you can never know how much security is enough because the world changes every day, and you need to make sure that your country will be safe even in the future. So they argue that great powers never end to never stop to pursue power because you never have enough power. And actually, in the defensive realist story, you have many defensive realists who argued that the rise of China could be managed without great power conflict because the US is a relatively safe great power. still number one. It's still have some kind of military advantage, and China was not directly threatened by anyone. Like the US didn't threaten to invade China or to send the Marines on Shanghai. So defensive realists believe that you didn't necessarily have to have a conflict. So I do believe that offensive realism was closer to the truth because you can see that even if the Chinese didn't have an existential threat looming over their head, they are still trying to go out of their borders to correct, to change the regional order. So they are not status quo's power. They are closer to revisionist power. So yes, I'm not surprising you, but saying that offensive realism was closer to the mark for me. And about your question about order, maybe you asked me, I believe. Um, it's not so much an East Asian order, but an East Asian disorder. There is no architecture as such. I don't see any way where you could put the US and China and Russia and North Korea and South Korea around the table and agreeing in some kind of regional power sharing, something like that. So I don't think there will be any order for the time being, and you will just see China with some support from Russia, probably North Korea, maybe also from Myanmar or from Cambodia, trying to build or to achieve regional hegemony. And you will see the US and all the countries I mentioned before trying very hard to contain China and to make sure that China does not succeed in taking over Taiwan and in winning over the South China Sea, in winning over its conflict with India. So we'll have a US-led containment effort, I believe. That will be the order or the disorder for the 2 or maybe 3 next decades.
Dylan, given the situation in Northeast Asia, as you identified, like a disorder, or there is no institutional umbrella institution, at least like ASEAN or the European Union, and North Korea always firing the missile, and China has similar issues in the South China Sea with neighboring countries, and through the Senkaku Islands with Japan, and the US deployed as an aircraft carrier in the region. And there is at least a disorder, and these great powers are close to each other. The merging of the maybe escalation is narrow. So what kind of the role can diplomacy play in mitigating these tensions and fostering cooperation between these rival powers? Do you think, is there any way or possibility?
So I would separate 2 kinds of diplomacies. One would be intra-alliance diplomacy or diplomacy among friends and diplomacy among rivals. So actually, there's not only bad news in East Asia. You have some good news. You've seen, for instance, the détente or the bettering relationship between South Korea and Japan, especially under the Yoon administration. So the United States has been playing a role in this, but also there's an understanding both in Japan and in South Korea that the 2 countries need to work together to contain China because South Korea or Japan alone do not have the sheer strength to resist Beijing. And you can see also new diplomatic relations emerging from South Korea towards Southeast Asia, from Japan towards Southeast Asia, also Japan, Australia, South Korea, India, all these countries bringing new kind of, like they like to call, minilateral or small level cooperation. So there is intense diplomacy within blocs. But when it comes to diplomacy among rivals, I don't think that diplomacy alone can solve much of anything because the conflict is not about something you can share around the table. This is not about creating some kind of institution or agreeing to a free trade agreement. This is about the basic power balance in East Asia. Who will be the dominant power? Will it be China as number one, or will China be contained and the US maintain a strong position? This is a zero-sum game. So I don't believe you will solve it by some kind of negotiation. But still, diplomacy has a role, and I'm afraid that many, even in Washington, don't understand that. In the sense that you want to keep the channels of communication with your enemies open. You know what they say, you should carry a big stick, but speak softly, right? So you want to make sure, if you have the United States, for instance, you want to make sure that you have a very strong um, defense posture in East Asia. You have a very strong alliance network in East Asia, so that China is not tempted to attack Taiwan or to solve its conflict with Japan or with Vietnam by using military force. So you want to have a very strong defensive line, but at the same time, you don't want to anger the Chinese too much. And actually, you don't want to smear the Chinese or to mouth the Chinese because you know it will provoke some kind of nationalistic response. And you've seen, I think, in Washington D.C., many people do the opposite. The U.S. defense posture in East Asia is weaker than ever. The U.S. military is overstretched. Um, it is now committed to giving weapons to Ukraine, in addition to supporting Israel. Uh, Also, while fighting a shooting war with the Houthis in Yemen. So you got several regions of the world where the U.S. military is engaged, and China is taking a lead in military capabilities. But at the same time, U.S. leaders sometimes like to poke the Chinese, um, for instance, by calling Xi Jinping a dictator, or a few years ago, boycotting the Olympics in China. This kind of behavior anger the Chinese, but does not change the balance of power on the ground. So I would argue that the US should do the contrary, actually bolster its military power on the ground and not mouth the Chinese too much. That's quite dangerous.
Dylan, do you think that for the US to bolster its military power in the region will be enough to compete or contend with China if US doesn't have enough economic capacity in the region? For example, the Indo-Pacific economic framework, do you think it's a war today can compete with the China's economic power in the region? For example, just if you give the ASEAN countries, Southeast Asian countries as an example, do you think that the US has this capacity to compete with China?
Mm. Um, as you know, the US is in a difficult financial situation where the US debt is growing quite quickly and the state deficit is quite important. So it will be hard for the US to increase military spending far above current levels. But what the US can do is rebalancing, focusing less forces on Europe, focuses less forces on the Middle East, and sending everything it has in East Asia. So that was the basic idea since the Obama administration and this famous pivot to Asia, which in a way started to happen under Obama too and under Trump. But since the war in Ukraine, you've seen that the US re-engaged in Europe in a quite massive manner. And a few weeks ago, many billions of dollars were again uh, committed to Ukraine. And there was this, of course, unpredicted war in the Middle East. which is also sucking away US resources. So the first answer is that the US need to refocus on East Asia if it wants to remain competitive with China. And the second answer is that, contrary to China, the US is not alone. The US has a strong network of allies in the region, and allies which have a lot of potential. South Korea is a wealthy and powerful country with um, a strong military capabilities. Japan is a very wealthy country. It had a weak military up to quite recently, but you've seen the trends that the Japanese are increasing their military efforts. And I think that a very important piece in all of that is India. And the more the Americans can cooperate with India, the more likely that they will be able to contain China. Because India is the only country in the Indo-Pacific which has um, enough resources to compete with China head on.
I touched on to upon to these details because you maybe more closely know Elbrich Colby always argued that he said that US should refocus on the Asia and less resources on Europe and in the Middle East and just focus. But there is another, I think, important details in Northeast Asia and also in Southeast Asia. The example of the South Korea and the Philippines. The politics is pretty much related to the political parties and the change of the governments. Today, of course, the UN administration at the power and with the US support, the relations between these two countries is good. But tomorrow, when another party come to power in South Korea, maybe another foreign policy direction will appear. And also in the Philippines, after the 6 years, maybe a similar government like Duterte administration come to power, what will happen? And another obstacle for the United States, I think, is a geographical distance. Still, yes, the US has a strong military network of the alliance, but I think the alliance still has domestic issues. And India, I think, is similar. To what extent the Quad is sustainable in the case of India. Okay, never mind. Just let me jump to my question. If you have any comment, you can add to this answer. How does the ongoing military modernization across Northeast Asia contribute to or potentially de-escalate the regional tensions, especially the change of the constitution in Japan in order to again bring some defensive capabilities, military modernization of the China and the nuclear build-up in China's mainland and North Korea's growing nuclear capability, South Korea as well. What will be your opinion in terms of the fostering cooperation or de-escalations? Do you see any link between military modernization and these two different subjects?
For sure. The main reason for understanding the current tension in East Asia go back to the Chinese military modernization effort which started during the 1990s. So during the 1990s, the Chinese came to believe they had enough money now to really start to increase their military power and to maybe one day outcompete the US and its allies in East Asia. So China's military modernization was the first driver, the initial motive for launching China on the road toward revisionism and the new trend of great power competition. So in that sense, I do believe that Japan, leaving away its legacy of post-World War II pacifism and going back to a normal state posture, which means building a full spectrum military force, which is able maybe to intervene outside, maybe even go to Taiwan in case of an emergency. I think Japanese build-up will be a factor for stability because you want to have very strong countries in East Asia, to try to reestablish a balance of power between China and the West. Because in international relations, the most dangerous situation you can have is when one state has an overwhelming superiority in military power and becomes able to uh, try to expand by force of arms and conquer the others. So you want to come back to a balanced situation in order to avoid a major war in East Asia. So Japanese modernizing their forces is a positive thing. You mentioned India. India also is pouring money to military forces, and you've seen during the last 2 or 3 years since the border incidents in 2020, where when a lot of Indian soldiers were killed on the border with China. But India has tried very hard to move new units toward the border with China and to create new infrastructures in the northern regions. So all of this is positive news. Uh, One less positive news, of course, is North Korea's behavior, which is, of course, now a nuclear state with a working nuclear deterrent. And North Korea is now moving to develop, um, on one side, tactical nuclear weapons to be able to use them during an actual shooting war, if it came to this. And also, North Korea is trying to develop a, a working second strike capability. So even if North Korea was to suffer a nuclear strike from outside, it should be able to survive and launch another one. So they are trying to develop submarines, for instance. So this is still quite far in the future because um, North Korean submarine technology is very uh, obsolete. It's still based on 1970s Soviet design. So North Korea is still very far away from a guaranteed second strike capability, but it's going in the right direction. So if North Korea remains on China's side of the fence, this will have a destabilizing effect on the entire region because we will have now China and North Korea together against South Korea and the rest.
Dylan, just small comment before I forget. I would like to note it. How we can insert the North Korea and China mutual friendship treaty in 1960? How it will play a role during escalations?
Well, um, until very recently, I would have tell you that this 1962 alliance was a paper alliance because both sides did not want to get dragged into each other's potential war. Uh, like 10 years ago, North Korea would have had no interest into going joining a war with China for the sake of Taiwan, for instance, or the other way around. China would not have wanted to risk everything to save North Korea in a Korean war. But what you have seen since the collapse of Kim Jong Un and Trump diplomacy is that North Korea, even if it doesn't want to, is moving to the Chinese side of the fence because the North Koreans now believe that the US is close to diplomacy and that they will be unable to build working relations with the US and to put an end to this sanction regime. So the North Koreans have come to the conclusion that the only working solution was to work closely with China and Russia too. Uh, so to answer your question directly, I think that this alliance is finding a new life, is again coming to the forefront. And now I know that many people in the US are very worried that if you have a war over Taiwan, the North Koreans may be tempted to join too, and the Chinese may actually encourage North Korea to at least provoke South Korea, or maybe even start a war with South Korea in order to deflect or to distract the US from a war over Taiwan. So
I
it
think
used to be.
from here, I think the US forces in South Korea playing important role in bringing North Korea into the escalation or bringing China into the conflict. The involvement of the US forces in South Korea will play important role during an escalation, I think. If they include the other party also, most probably will join to the conflict. Do you agree?
Now I do agree because I do believe that mistakes were made, and during the Trump administration, we came far closer than what people usually believe to a comprehensive agreement between the US and North Korea. And maybe you saw, I think it was last year, Mike Pompeo, I think he wrote his autobiography,
Yes, yes,
and
yes.
he recounted his encounter with Kim Jong-un from North Korea. And Mike Pompeo asked him, uh, so you want US forces to leave South Korea, right? And Kim Jong-un answered, oh, no, never. Because if US forces leave Korea, now we are alone against China, and we will become the new Xinjiang or the new Tibet. Like we will be a new province of China. We do not want that. But because the diplomacy collapsed toward the end of the Trump administration, and now that so you have Joe Biden who is not interested at all in North Korea, and the South Korean administration also is very tough on North Korea. So the North Koreans have no choice but working with the Chinese. That's why we have this very bad situation where, as you said, you could have a situation where North Korea could join a war about Taiwan.
Okay. And Dylan, given again the crisis and the potential of crisis in the region, what do you see any risk of miscalculation or unintended escalation in the context of the heightened military presence of the US and the growing capability of the China and the transition of Japan from the pacifist area to the offensive area, and North Korean, of course, growing military capability and missile launch, and I'm not sure to what extent include Russia.
So, as a general point, I do not believe that wars often start due to accidents or due to inadvertent escalation. Um, I do believe that most wars in history are usually planned or at least wanted by at least one side, because when the two sides want to avoid war, they usually succeed. So at least you need to have one side who is ready for war. So I do believe that accidents do not often lead to shooting wars. But to come back to your point, um, I think you have two regions where an accident could happen. And the two regions for me are the South China Sea and the Indian border. When it comes to Korea, I do believe that if you have a conflict, it will be started by a calculated provocation from North Korea, not by any kind of accident. It will be because North Koreans calculated that they can have some political benefit by, for instance, firing artillery shells at South Korea, or sinking a South Korean ship like they did 15 years ago. The same for Taiwan. I don't believe that Taiwan will come to a war due to any miscalculation, but it may come to this if the Chinese decide that they are ready for an invasion. What is most dangerous now maybe is the South China Sea, because that's an area, and you saw around the Philippines during the recent weeks, where you have uh, militias and coast guards um, interacting with each other on a daily basis, and sometimes you have ships colliding with each other. So that's a region where an accident could escalate in a situation where the US is dragged in and is forced to intervene. And one very worrying spot for me is India. We don't talk very much about this, About India, it's quite forgotten because of the geography. This conflict is quite hidden in the Himalaya mountains and quite forgotten by the wider world. But you have also very often Chinese and Indian patrols who are bumping into each other. And sometimes you saw these videos where uh, people were fighting with sticks and rocks because they don't want to use weapons, because the moment you start shooting, it's an actual war. So they try to avoid that. But that's a place where an accident could happen. And it's often forgotten, unfortunately, but that's a very dangerous place.
I think this is the difference between the land geopolitics and maritime geopolitics. Dylan, the domestic political consideration of the countries in Northeast Asia, specifically South and North Korea, play important role in shaping their foreign policy. So, how this shape their foreign policy approach towards the rivalry between the great power competition? You know, the South Korea supply weapon to the Ukraine or the Poland, and North Korea also supply the weapon to the Russia or towards the Middle East. How these domestic foreign policy considerations of these countries affect their foreign policy, choose side or approach to the great power rivalry?
Mm. So I wouldn't say that domestic politics is the main driver in South Korea and North Korea's alliance choices in among the great powers. I do believe that their environment is so constrained that they have little choices anyway. So domestic politics is not the thing which forces South Korea to align with the US or North Korea to align with China, but domestic politics matters to some secondary choices. And you mentioned the war in Ukraine. I think that's a very good example, because I'm not sure that South Korea would have supported um, giving or delivering ammunition to the Ukrainians the way it did if it hadn't been for the Yoon administration. If the Moon Jae-in administration was still there, I do believe they would have tried to stay away from the war in Ukraine. But the Yoon administration is more supportive of the idea of a liberal rules-based order, and believe that helping Ukraine is in a way trying to salvage what can be of the liberal order. And from being here in South Korea, I have a sense that the people were very surprised by the Russian reply to South Korea helping Ukraine and also selling more and more weapons to Poland and other Eastern European countries. Because when South Korea decided um, to involve itself in Eastern Europe, I think people expected Russia to complain or maybe to make an angry face, but the Russians would not move on the ground. And people in South Korea were quite surprised to see this renewed Russian-North Korea partnership, where the North Koreans would send all these weapons and ammunition to the Russians, and the Russians now are starting to send back technological support. We also seen the Russians providing oil to the North Koreans, which in theory is in opposition to the UN sanction regime. Of course, Russia and China recently vetoed or put an end to the UN monitoring system of a North Korean sanction regime. So people in South Korea have a sense that uh, their support for Ukraine had unfortunate consequences. They didn't expect Russia to behave that way. And when it comes to North Korean domestic politics, I don't believe this is what played a major role, because North Korea saw a golden opportunity and jumped in. It has nothing to do with regime survival. I think they would have done that anyway, because the Russians came and just asked them, give us ammunition, give us weapons, we need them now. and we will give you everything you want in return. And I think that's a very good deal, whoever is in power. So I don't think that domestic politics is the main driver in North Korea.
From here, Dylan, the national sentiment and the historical grievances, for example, and of the Korean War and the legacy of Japan Empire's occupation in China and Korea play important role, I think, for these countries to the approach toward the great power rivalry. What will be your take on this subject?
You're right that in South Korea, of course, there is still a lot of resentment toward Japan's appealing behavior during World War II, and of course the comfort woman phenomenon, where Japan reduced thousands of Korean women into sexual slavery. But I think that the structural incentives for Japan and South Korea to work together are so strong that this is overriding domestic politics. And even in very recent days, you had some contention between Japan and South Korea over it's quite complicated, but the ownership of the Line company back in Japan, because Line, which is a very big Japanese company, has some financial dealing with Naver, which is a big South Korean company. Anyway, there's a conflict over that. And when you have this kind of conflicts flaming up, people in South Korea tend to react very strongly. But because the power competition in East Asia is becoming so worrisome, you can see that this kind of anti-Japanese rhetoric is toning down, and the government, South Korean government, is trying very hard to make the people forget about these historical grievances. So yes, there is still in East Asia resentment toward Japan and this World War II behavior, but I think this will not impede the creation of a pro-American bloc in a way. And in the same way, I don't think that resentment toward Japan is the main issue in China either. Actually, until 1972, the Chinese were quite happy with their relation with Japan. And it's only in 1972 that they remembered that the Senkaku Island were actually the Diaoyu Island, and they wanted to take it back. I don't think that resentment is the main thing here. Resentment matters a lot, but it matters because the Chinese government is using it as a rhetoric, as a propaganda tool to mobilize the population against Japan.
Dylan, given these complexities in the region, what are the potential flashpoints or areas of greatest competition in the coming years? Like whether we can say the tensions on the Korean Peninsula, whether it's nuclear weapons, or the Dokdo Islands issues between Japan and South Korea, or Senkaku Island between Japan and China. What kind of the flashpoints for escalations, potential escalations, we can expect in the future years?
There are so many. It would take 2 hours to study each of them. If you want at least one, if you want the biggest one, I think there's no doubt that it's Taiwan. It's the one region where you could have a shooting war between the US, China, and US allies. When it comes to the Dokdo Islands, I don't think this one is coming back. It is on the way to, I won't say being forgotten, but the Japanese government is not pushing very hard on this. And the South Koreans under President Yoon are also trying to better relations. So I don't see Dokdo becoming a big source of conflict. The Korean Peninsula is, of course, a very worrying spot, but I don't think it is as dangerous as Taiwan, because I don't think that North Korea would tempt an invasion anytime soon. That's not on the table right now. But one thing I want the viewers to maybe think about, and it's not often mentioned in the media, is the possibility of South Korea going nuclear. And staying here in Seoul, I can tell you that a lot of people, I don't mean only the security elite, but I mean the everyday people, the population in general, has become deeply uh, favorable or enamored with the idea of a South Korean nuclear deterrent. I think the surveys showed that around 70 or 75% of people in South Korea are now in favor of a South Korean nuclear deterrent. And 75%, I mean, it's a huge part of the population, right?
Yeah, Dylan, is it because of the concern over the change of administration in the White House, or the concern is about the technical capability of the extended nuclear deterrence to protect South Korea? What is the main reason?
So this consensus around nuclear weapons was already there before the concerns about the US administration. I think it has been almost than it's been many years that the South Korean public has become favorable to nuclear weapons. Of course, you have the North Korean problem, which has been there for almost 20 years now, since 2006. But what is new, what is changing also, is the perception in South Korea that China has become an actual rival or even a threat, while it used to be considered as a partner. So the new factor, of course, is China's willingness to reach regional hegemony. And a second factor also that people often forget is South Korean demography. South Korea is a country which is becoming old very quick, and the population is starting to decrease. So if you think 20 years down the road, South Korea may not have enough people to defend itself against North Korea and also maintain its regional standing against China and others. So demography is one big factor pushing toward a nuclear deterrent. And the cherry on top, of course, is the talk about the second coming of Donald Trump, and himself has suggested that the South Korean US alliance may go away. So I don't believe him too much. I don't think we should listen to everything he say. Uh, I think this is a tactics of him to try to uh, push the South Korean to spend more money on the US presence in South Korea. I don't think he would actually break the alliance, but for sure, this is having some role into South Korean people's perception of the need of a nuclear deterrent.
Dylan, from the middle power countries, do you think is there any potential that the middle powers, especially South Korea or Japan, can play a role to how can I say the mitigate de-escalation or rivalry between this impact of the rivalry between the great powers?
I'm afraid they can't. Uh, as we said earlier, I'm an old-fashioned realist. I do believe that the great powers are the one driving the train. So I don't believe that middle powers can de-escalate things. And actually, I would suggest you that the heart of the conflict is not between China and the US. It's between China and its neighbors, which the US is supporting. So if you think in a different way, there's no direct conflict between China and the US. Like the US and China don't have any conflict about territory or about uh, trying to reach hegemony in the other's region. But the problem is that China and its neighbors have conflict and tensions, and China wants hegemony in East Asia. And so the US is forced to come in here to intervene. So actually, Asian powers are not the one de-escalating. They are the one dragging the US in because the US does not want China to become a regional hegemon. And for that, it has to support Taiwan and others.
That's interesting point. So my last questions, Dylan, will be about considering the ongoing war in Gaza and Ukraine. How might these global events influence the dynamics of great power rivalry in Northeast Asia? Because I think there is a link, for example, with China and Iran and the Middle East and North Korea also another party, I think, and US also another party. So how these developments in the Middle East and Ukraine or in Europe will affect the rivalry between these great powers in the global level?
So, in one sentence, it will make everything worse. But I would be very careful not to put Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea into the same bag. They are all different countries, and especially when it comes to Iran, I think Iran is a very independently minded country. I don't think it's part of any uh, Chinese-Russian bloc, and I don't think the Iranians would follow China or Russia in any war in Europe or East Asia. So I think Iran is a different problem. But the war in Ukraine has refocused the US on Europe, and a lot of people in Washington, D.C. Have this belief that Russia is more dangerous than China. And as I have been arguing for a long time, and of course you mentioned Bridge Colby in the US, China is not Russia is not the number one threat. Russia, of course, is a powerful country, and Russia has ambitions to change its borders and to change the order in Europe. But Russia is not about to conquer the entire Europe and to land on New York and conquer Washington. And Russia is a great power, but it's not an existential threat to the survival of NATO, for instance. So the US focusing on Ukraine is a loss for East Asia because it has far less money and capabilities to focus on East Asia. And when it comes to the Middle East and the war in Gaza, I think also the US has not been very wise, and with this policy of supporting Israel to the very end, it has embroiled itself in a new conflict, which may take months to solve. I mean, we don't know how long the Israeli army will stay in Gaza. And once again, the US is spending money and resources on a secondary conflict, which has nothing to do with the main threat, which is China, and it should be focusing on. So all these wars the US is participating in Europe and Middle East are actually making the situation in Asia worse because the US has less power to maintain the balance, and the Chinese may be more tempted to take risk over Taiwan.
Thank you very much, Dylan, for this terrific conversation.
You're most welcome.
Yes. We come to end of our show. And also thank you for our audiences, those who spare time to stay with us until the end of the show. And also thank you for others who will watch the record of the video later. Please don't forget to subscribe to my channel. And see you in the next upcoming shows. Have a good day. Have a good night.